Hi, everybody. I'm Bob Bowman, Editor-in-Chief for Supply Chain Brain, and I want to welcome you to this fifth episode in a six-part series on creating resilient supply chains through IT innovation, presented by Deloitte Consulting. The topic today is strategic supplier management, the balance between breadth and depth. Now, before we get started, I want to remind everybody about the sixth and final episode in this six-part series. The topic will be innovations in supply chain planning and optimization of data. It goes live on June 29th at 11 a.m. Eastern. Don't miss it. Now, one quick reminder, there will be an audience question and answer session at the end of this presentation. Audience members are encouraged to submit their questions at any time during the presentation by clicking on that Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. So the COVID-19 pandemic exposed how little organizations knew about their supply chains. At the same time, growing concerns over ESG, that is environment, social, and governance, have accelerated the need for companies to meet tough new regulatory requirements. It all comes down to a need for strong and resilient supply chains built on collaborative supplier relationships. So today, we're going to learn about how leading organizations are fostering new relationships to promote sustainable procurement, supplier diversity, and true supply chain transformation. With that, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Milton Jones is a senior manager of supply chain network in the supply chain and manufacturing operations practice of Deloitte Consulting, LLP. Milton has over 10 years of industry and consulting experience in the energy and industrial manufacturing sector. He has deep experience specifically working with energy companies on digital transformation and business process improvement-related efforts. His areas of expertise include robotic process automation, spend analytics, reliability-centered maintenance, supply chain process improvement, go-to-market strategy, and new product development. With that, allow me to turn it over to Milton Jones. Milton, take it away.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you all for being here. Really appreciate the time to speak with you today. Let's dive right into the content. Here we go. So apologies, let me go back one. All right, so as we think about the landscape for resiliency and sustainability, there's been growing pressures in the market from both regulators, customers, et cetera. So, for example, if we think about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, CO2 concentration is at its peak, and there's 50% reduction in carbon emissions needed to limit 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature rise, resulting in governments, investors requiring companies to scale their decarbonization efforts, applying pressure organizations to have an extensive ESG data collection strategy. Also, the Science-Based Target Initiative, or SBTI, Target Dashboard, according to that group, over 4,800 companies have made public commitments to take actions to mitigate ESG risks, including setting science-based targets and net zero commitment goals. Such client-related commitments requires increased supplier engagement to achieve emissions reduction goals across your value chain. And even though such ESG pressures exist and organizations have made bold ESG commitments, the events of the last few years, including COVID-19, has really revealed how little organizations know about their extended value chain, whether it's labor human right risk that are the halting solar panel supply, or ethics risks that are disrupting F-35 deliveries. ESG risk, particularly amongst your supplier base, directly impact your organization's security of supply. So if we move forward, as we think about, how do you approach sustainability and resiliency in your value chain? Historically, companies have really taken a reactive and narrow approach to achieving sustainability, driving high processing costs and underwhelming results. For example, companies typically decide to leverage current state reporting to gather sustainability metrics, but as you know, these metrics and reporting tools have evolved or do evolve, requiring companies to evolve as well to drive more stakeholder confidence. In addition, organizations historically only focus on their, abatement strategies and sustainability initiatives solely within its four walls, failing to consider the extended value chain that disproportionately affects your organization's performance and emissions. And finally, companies' risk management activities typically focus on their tier one suppliers, However, recent examples of supply chain disruption described earlier actually were more tied to tier 2 suppliers and beyond, presenting the most unknown risk and highlighting the importance of supply chain resiliency across your landscape. So as we think about, how do we go about managing your value chain? So as a result of these ESG risks and pressures, organizations recently recognized the importance of collecting sustainability and operations resiliency data for their extended value chain. However, data collection is costly, and organizations struggle to maintain the level of visibility needed to generate accurate, actionable insights. One of the challenges in extended value chain collection is actually identifying and capturing all of the risk factors across the value chain, including expanded scope 3 sources and extensive risk factors across numerous domains. In addition, the resource constraints to actually conduct such extended ESG data collection is significant. The process requires uncovering all of your supply partners, determining the key data domains, and then aggregating such domains from various data sources for centralized storage, and then conducting an extensive verification of that data. Such procedures can really place an acute strain on your organizational resources. And then finally, the complexities of the risk factors and process and organization constraints in conducting that extended value chain ESG data collection can really limit the organization's ability to shift from a sole focus on data collection to also generating insights and intelligence and prioritizing improvement areas to really mitigate these ESG risks for your supplier base and unlock value for your stakeholders. So we think about how do we row together with your suppliers, right? How do we really drive value in collaboration with your suppliers to drive things forward? So to achieve true, sustainable, resilient supply chains, organizations must ensure that their suppliers are moving in the same direction to achieve positive, sustainable outcomes. To drive the importance of this risk, according to a recent global supply chain report, supply chain emissions, mostly driven by third parties, represent 11 times higher emissions than operational emissions within a company's four walls, equating to 92% of a company's total GHG emissions. Therefore, prioritizing focus on your supply chain and your suppliers represents the biggest levers to achieve your ESG objectives. But work is needed to properly identify actually which suppliers and specific risks are causing the most hindrance to your company's decarbonization efforts or targets. On the supplier side, many struggle with the lack of understanding of how to take specific actions to improve their emissions and ESG footprint. And finally, as discussed, organizations need better clarity on the specific resiliency and reputational risk that may be uncovered along their tier-in supply network in order to truly mitigate their risk and achieve security of supply. So as we think about sustainability and resiliency, it is a team sport, right? To really achieve these goals, organizations must think about their suppliers as true partners. They must collaborate with their supplier ecosystem and help identify and unlock trapped value in order to improve ESG objectives, which can generate both positive societal change as well as economic benefits for all participants. Collaborating with suppliers in co-development innovations not only mitigates ESG risk for all parties, but also generates new business markets and opportunities to accelerate economic value for the partnership. As stated, our research sees that companies need to really set these ESG goals, but they're hindered by collaboration with suppliers to help them transition to their operations. So it's important that we roll together with our suppliers towards the ESG objectives to really drive direct enablement and joint collaboration to really address this imbalance. So how do we do that? So we think about, taking various steps along the way. To optimize your value creation along your extended value chain, companies must first tackle data transparency, but that's just the foundation. Companies must also invest in capabilities to transform their data collection into identification of opportunities to improve their ESG footprint, and ultimately co-implement solutions to modernize their extended value chain and accelerate their both environmental and social benefits. Let's think about the framework here, right? So Deloitte has what we call a value chain enablement approach to help companies modernize their value chain and achieve sustainable, resilient supply chains. First, we help companies illuminate their regulatory compliance requirements and supply chain risk across multi-tier to establish critical visibility of both environmental and social factors that impacts the organization's sustainability and resiliency journey. Second, we help companies identify, collect, and aggregate granular supplier data across numerous ESG risk domains to support compliance and reporting, as well as identify which category hotspots are most material impacts to an org's emission, and thus present the best opportunity for growth through their enablement solutions. Third, we leverage these granular databases to optimize supplier enablement investments through advanced ESG intelligence that automatically compares your supplier's sustainability performance against benchmarks and competitors to identify that areas of strength. Next, we empower and support suppliers to reach their sustainable and social goals through finance and tax programs that reduce those investment burdens for your supply base. And then finally, we help companies enhance their ESG objectives by helping to monetize their emission transition investment through carbon offsetting. So let's go through each of these elements in total. So first, as we think about illuminate of your suppliers, I've talked about the importance of multi-tier elimination to proactively sense third-party risk from your tier 2 suppliers. But there's various recent cautionary tales that crystallizes the importance of proactive multi-tier risk management. For example, last fall, more than 1,000 shipments of solar energy companies worth hundreds of millions of dollars were actually piled up at the U.S. ports and were there for months since last June because of a new law that banned imports from China's region due to pressure from Washington and from the U.S. government around Yijing's Uyghur detention camp risk around and concerns about slave labor. So upon investigation, it was determined that these detained panels and polysilicon cells resulted from risks stemming from the solar companies, actually tier 2 Chinese manufacturers. The primary solar companies had limited knowledge of these tier 2 manufacturers' human rights risk upfront ahead of time. And if they had these capabilities to proactively address these risks, their solar panel, shipments, their supply chain risk could have been mitigated. So this story really underscores the importance of achieving proactive transparency and monitoring of both your social and environmental risk along your multi-tier supply network. The next element of this is around identify. So, achieving broad collection and aggregation of ESG data enables orgs to help identify those specific suppliers who are directly negatively impacted their ESG progress. Leading companies are leveraging integration APIs to aggregate both scope 1 and 2 data, enterprise data, internal and external supplier data, and additional enrichment data to create centralized ESG data platforms that pinpoints which suppliers actually pose the greatest risk. Once those suppliers and risk are identified, we then help companies prioritize their value chain enablement efforts, customized based on their top risk factors. Value chain enablement includes providing suppliers access to emissions-reducing solutions, equipping suppliers with access to customized learning content to enhance their awareness of what the best practices are in the market, and then improving your ESG footprint across domains, as well as improving their ability to once again pinpoint those suppliers' emissions categories to support those disclosure agreements. Next, I want to mention Optimize. So as we think about Optimize, ESG decision support tools powered by AI and machine learning intelligence engines and simulations can actually help quantify the sustainability return on investment, your carbon liability, and the ESG change impact for each enablement option defined to optimize those critical investment decisions. For example, sustainability ROI optimization, simulations can be run against each scenario to generate that return on investment and prioritize your ESG decision making. These ESG intelligence solutions can really help organizations identify or understand which specific sustainability enablement technologies, whether it's renewable power, hydrogen, et cetera, will deliver the largest return on investment from a sustainability perspective and help manage their carbon exposure in conjunction with their sustainability improvement efforts and activities, as well as understand which additional performance improvement levers can further enhance and improve their ESG rating. As we move to the next element around empower. So as we think about empower, once improvement opportunities are identified within your supplier base, leading companies deploy green finance programs and tax rebates to reduce their investment burden for suppliers to enable them to invest in critical capabilities. So companies have really leading companies have provided suppliers with access to really positive financing partnership and positive lending terms based on an ESG score, purchase energy mix, as well as carbon ambitions and commitments. One really good example of this over in Europe, in terms of the starting point, is with Coca-Cola. So Coca-Cola set a net zero emissions target for 2040, including a goal to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions across its entire value chain by 30% by the end of the decade. However, Coca-Cola realized that over 90% of their emissions were attributed to their extended value chain. Therefore, Coca-Cola realized that it's crucial for them to work directly with their suppliers to decarbonize their businesses collectively to meet their bold emissions targets. To help finance that effort, Coca-Cola actually established a very novel sustainability-linked finance scheme in partnership with a food and agri bank called Rabobank to actually meet certain environmental and social goals. So what they did was they had very positive financing rates that they actually gave out to suppliers that were linked to key ESG performance indicators that if these suppliers met these indicators, they would unlock very incremental discounts against their funding rate to invest in these solutions. To achieve these discounted rates, suppliers must set and validate its emissions reduction targets within the Science-Based Target Initiative I mentioned, commit to using 100% renewable electricity across its operations, which is pretty bold, and share their carbon footprint data all by the end of this year. This program was initially launched in Germany with plans for the financing program to expand to Coca-Cola suppliers across the rest of Europe, Australia, and New Zealand in order to create a more responsible and sustainable food and beverages industry. So that's just one bold example of how companies are really using green finances to really empower suppliers. In addition, there's over $270 billion of tax benefits that are geared towards incentivizing suppliers to invest in sustainable solutions, such as clean electricity, energy efficiency, and clean fuels in order to help the extended value chain reach its targets. And then the final kind of value piece I wanted to bring up is around enhance. So as we think about enhance, beyond financing and tax incentives, world-class organizations are looking at their carbon footprint holistically. And instead of purchasing carbon credits from companies who kind of offset its carbon emissions, establishing carbon kind of offset programs, establishing carbon insetting programs, which is actually focused on companies and suppliers decarbonizing their own value chains to generate nature positive solutions and operations through direct investment in resilient and regenerative solutions, such as reforestation, renewable energy, or regenerative agriculture. One example of carbon insetting is a company called Gani, which is a Denmark-based fashion brand, who set bold commitments to reduce its carbon footprint by 50% by the end of the year and decide to actually not work with stage 1 to 3 suppliers that use coal-generated heat or energy by 2025. To meet these commitments, they actually incorporated circular processes such as recycling fabrics, and they moved from carbon offsetting to insetting and directly invest in decarbonizing its own value chain. Its first insetting project was actually established last year, and they worked with 2 suppliers in Portugal to install its first solar panels, as well as build a new facility where renewable energy reduction is integrated into the facility's design. This brand also worked with suppliers on protecting and supporting its local biodiversity of its facilities collectively. So really, and think about insetting, it's about owning your decarbonization efforts and really accelerating, taking to the next level of accelerating those ESG benefits by financially investing in your supplier's transition to sustainable solutions. So as we think about sustainability and resiliency and really unlocking value creation. So wanted to really kind of finalize with some stats that really underline the importance of really mobilizing not only your organization, but your extended supply chain to the sustainability and resiliency objectives. So one of the things I wanted to focus on was really first around brands. What we've seen out in the market is, 70% of companies are more likely to really remember companies that exhibit a strong purpose, right? We've also seen a stronger protection in terms of more likely to be protected in the face of publicity with investing in purpose. From an innovation and sales perspective, we've seen based on data, 53% of surveyed executives in the C-suite really reported new revenue streams, new innovations by investing in purpose-driven activity. Also, from a market products perspective, we've seen 39% price premium on products that were tied to sustainability. From a returns standpoint, companies that have really met those stakeholder expectations of sustainability have achieved a 6.4% higher return on equity. And then from a cost saving standpoint, right, from an operations standpoint, we've really seen companies that really develop these programs actually achieve lower logistics and supply chain costs in the market and actually improve performance. So improvement with your employees actually that are connected to your purpose outcomes results in decreased safety incidents, lower turnover, and improved profitability. So one of the things I want to mention here is, it's not only just the right thing to do to invest in purpose and social and environmental type activities, but it's actually good for business, right? It's good for your bottom line. It's good for the positive impact you make in your stakeholders and your shareholders. So it's now more than ever, leading companies are really embracing purpose, sustainability, and equity in a way that delivers long-term value for its company, its value chain, its shareholders, and ultimately its society. So finally, I want to wrap up with, as we think about where you are on your journey, right? So whether you're, setting, ambition, sustainability ambitions and setting your targets, whether you are, getting to the level of, hey, I really know what my targets are, but I want to start to gather that data and understand the investment portfolio. You're at the point where you want to get a little bit more intelligence unlocked from your sustainability data management. You want to really look at your third-party risk management, all the way up to, hey, I really want to help drive brand differentiation in the market. Regardless of where you are, Deloitte, we have a suite of tools to help drive sustainability and resiliency across the market, all the way from strategy setting through operational execution. So really, we want to, say, thank you for this time. We'll turn it over to the panel, but really want to emphasize the importance of, really these tools and processes that leading companies have done to really drive resilient, sustainable supply chains. With that, I'll pass it over to Bob.
Thanks so much, Milton, for that great presentation. This is the panel discussion portion of our presentation, where I have the privilege of being able to ask you a few more questions before we turn it over to the audience. And by the way, audience, please do continue to submit your questions, and we'll get to those as many as possible, time permitting. Just a couple of quick terms, just to make sure we remind our audience: ESG, environment, social governance. Also, scope 3 emissions are those emissions, as you say, Milton, that are generated by your supply chain partners over whom you, the OEM or the brand, have no direct control. Obviously, the biggest challenge. I just want to ask you a little bit more, Milton, about the chain of communication and reporting structure. I mean, obviously, you've got a brand or an OEM that needs to assemble all this carbon emission information from its suppliers all the way through the sub-tiers. How is that coming up to them? Are they responsible for communicating directly with the OEM or brand, or does each stage report to the next stage and then the tier 1 supplier turns it all over? How does that typically work?
Yeah. So historically, in terms of the reporting, it would be the tier 1 suppliers reporting or requesting through questionnaires, et cetera, those targets or those measures with their tier 2 to tier 3, et cetera. What we've seen is through that historical process, there's been challenges in the accuracy and really the resiliency of that data collection. So what we've tried to do is try to help companies understand how can we actually gather some of this data collectively. So actually having your supplier base opt into a portal where you're reporting those items or those ESG metrics and measures, so that all of various companies can see that, right? So if it's not proprietary, we're looking at opportunities to actually have companies opt into that portal where it's shared amongst companies to report in their ESG measures, as well as ways to, if we look at third-party data, how can we support them to actually gather some of that third-party data without actually having to send out a questionnaire to the supplier? So one example is, and my passion around supplier diversity, one of the things that companies struggle with is, hey, how do we certify, how do we confirm the certification of a diverse supplier on the tier 2, tier 3 level? We typically just reach out, send a questionnaire over from the tier 1 to the tier 2 to get that data. But what we said is, hey, we can go directly to those certifying bodies and gather the data directly for that particular supplier you want us to capture. So that's just one example on how we're trying to improve the reporting processes.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, great. The end game here, obviously, and as you point out so well, Milton, is a resilient supply chain. Tell me more about what that means and what the future of resilient supply chains look like to you based on everything you've told us today.
Yeah, absolutely. So first and foremost, it shouldn't come as a surprise to folks. The first characteristic of a future resilient supply chain is around that digitalization, right? So how do we, through tools, through digital technologies, really enable a complete 360 visibility of your supply chain to improve transparency and traceability of your materials and products throughout its supply chain, right? So getting back to that solar panel example, right? If they had more visibility of their supply chain up front, they would be able to track that and mitigate that before the panels were kind of stuck at the ports, right? So digital solutions include, probably you all know, blockchain, digital twin, advanced analytics to really drive proactively identifying and mitigating those performance risks. So that's one. Two is this idea of a circular supply chain, including greater planning and strategic coordination from procurement to its stakeholders. So really having your procurement function really be a valued advisor and having understandings of their materials along the circularity of its product in order to transform it into trusted advisors on supplier knowledge, incorporating those environmental and social criteria in their sourcing decisions. And then finally, standardizing, right? And I think we all know that, right? Standardizing your processes, procedures, and data across your supply chain, syncing that with all of your stakeholders really drives more effective collaboration with your suppliers to really lower those costs and improve that product lifecycle management. So I would say those are the key features to really build secure and sustainable supply chains.
Is reporting standardized among all these supply chain partners? Are there any issues about standardizing the way by which you measure and report carbon emissions and any kind of other emissions?
Yeah. So its reporting is always it's tricky to depend upon the regulation, right? So what we, especially as it relates to ESG, we've seen that certain regulators and policies require different types of reports in order to ensure compliance, right? So one of the things we've seen out in the market is, especially when it relates to ESG, within the U.S. and even globally, they're evolving regulations, they're evolving policies, and they require different reports. So it's important to have a dedicated view or work with a third-party company to really help you get the latest understanding of what those reporting requirements are, because the regulations are evolving, as you know.
Yeah. Milton, you mentioned some tools that Deloitte itself has to help companies achieve resilience, approaches to bolster some sustainable supply chain resilience. Tell me more about some of those tools.
No, absolutely. So Deloitte, we have numerous, but I think the one I want to focus on this discussion is a managed service offering we call Sustainability 360 that is powered by Salesforce. This tool is kind of focused on helping organizations establish visibility into their carbon footprint and just broader ESG performance, maintain a proactive stance against these regulatory compliance requirements I talked about, resolve those identified deficiencies and risks, and then provide continuous stakeholder transparency. So our offering, features include core ESG data collections that I've been talking about, emissions accounting, expanded ESG data collection, expanded global regulation reporting, and then also supplier dashboards and analytics, as well as learning materials and really driving community portals for your supplier community. So for more information, please reach out.
Great. Would you recommend building some requirements? I mean, at some point you have to make your suppliers know that this is required of them. To what extent do you need to build this into supplier contracts, and how do you go about doing that to make sure that language is clear and it's going to be followed?
No, absolutely. Yeah. So I think the biggest thing, even before we even get to the contract, is in the sourcing event, making sure that those ESG requirements are reflected in your supplier selection, right? So as even evaluating whether you want to bring this new supplier on, set up a contract with this new supplier, making sure that those questions and evaluation criteria includes some of these ESG metrics. And then finally, in terms of the contract structure, yes, it's about once again, because of the evolving regulatory requirements, it's important to look at each category, right? Each category has different sets of regulations and ESG requirements. So we want to make sure we customize those contracts and structure in a way that's really tied to the services that they're serving, and thus the ESG requirements against that service. So yeah, it's really, I would say, take it a contract level, a category rather, level view in structuring those contracts.
You certainly want a tier one supplier attesting to the fact that they will not be employing any sub-tier manufacturer suppliers that beyond the knowledge of the OEM or the brand, because that, of course, is where the most disturbing disasters have happened in recent years, is those sub-tiers of brand who say, I had no idea that my product was being made in this factory. Well, somehow that visibility has to be made possible. And I think you're giving us some great advice on how to achieve that, Milton. I think at this point, I'd like to bring the audience in, if that's okay with you, Milton. Let's get some audience questions here. And even as we are answering these questions that have already come in, audience members are encouraged to continue to submit your questions, and we'll get to as many of those as we can, time permitting. So this audience member is saying, for sustainability to be fully realized, how do we leverage external organizational players and the community to bolster ESG goals?
Yeah. So I think, the biggest thing in empowering your supplier base is creating incentives that drive a win-win, right? So historically, we've seen, actually, I've been part of it personally, right? So one of my clients is a power utilities company, and we're a management consulting company, Deloitte. They would come to us and say, hey, we mandate that you totally revamp your contractors so that you have 20% of your suppliers that are diverse. Now, think about that, right? In a moment's notice, we have to totally rethink about our staff and our resources to achieve this target. If we think about up front, as we're starting to build the project and think about the team working together to say, hey, let's talk about how this is important to have a diverse team that's a benefit for you and us, and let's plan ahead of time to structure the teams appropriately in order to achieve those diversity outcomes. That's just one example, but really it's about creating win-win scenarios. And instead of having more of a mandate and say, hey, you must do this, more of a conversation with them up front, right? Right when you set up the contract, right when you're about to do work, to say, hey, this is what we're looking to achieve. We think this is important for us. We think it's important for you, right? The Coca-Cola example is a good example, right? Working with suppliers that wanted to meet those ESG metrics allow Coca-Cola to provide those really benefit financing rates for them, right? So I would say that's the biggest thing, really driving good collaboration.
Yeah. The questioner used the word community. I wonder if that also includes NGOs and organizations that are tasked specifically with the job of visiting factories, monitoring human rights conditions, things like that, partnering with you on that in that end. Are they also valuable entities to be brought into the picture?
No, absolutely. I think, one of the things that, I wanted to also, call out is whether sustainability or diversity, there's a host of communities out there that are dedicated to really helping you achieve these values, right? So, yes, a lot of this, especially recently, has been driven by regulatory mandates, but really it's about doing good in the society, right? And there's a host of nonprofits, organizations, communities that really, within Supplier Diversity, for example, several diversity certifying bodies, in terms of women or minority-owned business councils that are dedicated to helping you achieve these goals. So I would say definitely take advantage of those, but ultimately it's about, how do we, really work together and how these clients collaborate with the suppliers to help them scale and grow to reach those targets, right? One of the things I've seen a lot of is, hey, if you don't meet this goal, then we're just gonna switch you out and pick another supplier. If you see the supplier has potential to really be a good partner for you, how do we work together to help them scale? How do you become an investor to help develop those suppliers to reach those environmental and social goals? It's something I don't see a lot of, and I think that's important to have in the market.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you mentioned that, Milton, because so often we talk about the need for supplier collaboration. That word is so vague. What do we mean by supplier collaboration? I think you've helped to answer that a little bit just now when you say that. This audience member is saying, what are some examples of the latest best practices that you see being implemented by some of the more mature companies globally and across various industries? You alluded to Coca-Cola as one. Got any others?
Yeah. So I'll use another company. I would say, I'm in the oil and gas industry, so I would say, Chevron is one of the companies that have really taken bold bets as it relates to renewable energy. There's more to be done, but I think, I think the biggest thing that they said is, we want to invest in these businesses, and we're willing to actually invest, getting back to what you said, invest in these companies from the ground up, really help them scale, provide them opportunity to pilot with these companies at certain sites and regions in order to really generate value. So really across industries, we've seen the companies step up and say, hey, we want to invest, right? And you might not, I think some of the companies we've seen out in the market, I think one of the reasons their hesitancy with, actually investment is they don't see that realized returns right away, right? But I think in terms of thinking about a long-term value, especially for companies that are well established, I think the long-term benefits is going to be worth kind of those short-term investments. So I think it's important for companies to take a longer-term view in deciding if they want to invest in kind of smaller companies and help them scale. Because if you help companies scale, think about it, they're going to be much value partners for you, right? You're not going to see as much turnover with suppliers wanting to do business if you've actually helped them scale and grow and achieve values for a win-win for you and the supplier. So that's what I'll say.
Thank you. Here's a question that kind of asks you to elaborate a little bit on what you've already been talking about, but they're asking about some key strategies that organizations can proactively leverage to manage supplier diversity risk and human rights to ensure supply chain resilience. Maybe that would include how do you even go about finding diverse suppliers? How do you end up engaging with them? How do you keep them? What overall strategies do you have to minimize the risk of not being diverse in your supplier base?
No, absolutely. Yeah, so we've talked a lot about sustainability and emissions, but I'm also very passionate about supplier diversity, so I appreciate the question. So it's important for companies to really achieve these equitable outcomes in which systemic barriers are eliminated and all these internal and external stakeholders really have fair access, right, and a sense of belonging. So as I mentioned before, right, if you have a sense of belonging, a sense of inclusion in your ecosystem, you just have more a commitment to that ecosystem, right? So we think about how do you mitigate some of these supplier diversity risks? First of all, it's really elevating your supply chains where you have leadership buy-in, you have C-suite buy-in in terms of, hey, we're going to meet this target. We're going to do everything collectively within the enterprise to meet this target. And then finally, implementing advanced diversity metrics that go beyond just spend. We're thinking about revenues, that go directly to our underserved communities, et cetera. Having a growth mindset in terms of helping, as I mentioned before, focused on developing suppliers, helping to scale suppliers to be partners for you, and then viewing your suppliers as business partners to assure that you are developing your suppliers to achieve those optimal socioeconomic outcomes. So really, once again, how do you mitigate this diversity risk is through that true collaboration up front and making sure that, and once again, actually to your second question about identification, there's numerous databases, whether it's Supplier.io, the National Minority or Women-Owned Business Councils that I mentioned. A lot of those have very dedicated databases in order to really help, start that identification of those diverse suppliers by a particular category. But really it's about, collaborating and actually going out and doing reach out and campaigns yourself, whether it's, going out into your community. One of the companies I worked with, infrastructure company, we went out to Chicago and we actually had a community event where we brought in local suppliers and we really, helped vet them and evaluate them to be diverse suppliers for our community. So doing that reach out as well in complement with those dedicated databases can help you get a kickstart in finding those diverse suppliers for you.
I really like your emphasis, Milton, on the need to kind of nurture these suppliers along, because it's sort of a chicken and egg kind of thing. I mean, they're not going to be there unless you nurture them, but you need to bring them along. It's just interesting that you should keep hammering on that point. It's a very good one. Okay, so this questioner is saying, based on your understanding of recent supply chain disruptions and reactivity of industries, I think I know what they're talking about. What is your perspective of the so-called lag or pushback in terms of ESG responsiveness? A lot of companies kind of buckled down to survival strategy during the pandemic and sort of put aside the ESG efforts. And to what extent, and some are pushing back, as this questioner suggests. What's going on there, and how do you see that playing out?
No, that's a very good point, especially recently. Like there's been a lot of noise in the markets around, is ESG really, is that truly a priority for some of our companies, right? Mm-hmm. And obviously, as we know, with ebbs and flows of the market, that always happens, right? You gotta buckle down. But what I would say is, in the past, there hasn't been as much direct correlation between achieving these environmental social outcomes to economic benefits, financial benefits for your shareholders. Now
Right.
we have various amounts of data and statistics that actually highlight that, and I mentioned this in one of the final slides, that actually show various steps that say, hey, if you invest in these ESG metrics, in these ESG ambitions, and actually create a supplier extended value chain ecosystem that all rolls together towards those metrics, that's actually going to drive better sales, better brand reputation, better profitability, improve retention for your employees, et cetera, right? So we've seen that direct correlation. It's not a easy or short-term fix, as I said. It's a longer-term play, but definitely we've seen that direct correlation of having good purpose-driven activities and suppliers. It's just going to be a win-win-win for everybody. A win for your, as a company, a win for your suppliers, and a win for society.
That said, are there any obstacles still in a lot of companies in getting that message up to the C-suite when the C-suite is so concerned with quarterly results and immediately making a profit, and we have to do better this quarter than we did last quarter? Some of these green finance programs you talk about, they might involve a certain amount of upfront costs. Is there an educational thing going on there that we still need to hammer home with top executives of the ultimate benefits to be derived from this whole project?
No, absolutely. Yeah, I do think, whether it's from a political standpoint or others, there is a lot of noise out there that is hindering some of our executives to really, look at the data and look at the numbers. But what we're doing, Deloitte and others, is really helping to really drive that narrative and really drive the data that really shows that correlation. And really, it's like I said, it's around the investment, right? And what we've seen more and more, especially from sustainability for us from an equitable standpoint, your customers they have buying power, and they're putting their money where their mouth is, and they're saying, hey, if I don't see that you're committed to these sustainable and equitable outcomes, I'm going to go elsewhere. I'm going to take my dollars elsewhere. So we're seeing that direct. So I think that's the message we have to kind of hammer home to them, is say, hey, I know you have all these other disruptions and you want to have other priorities. But really, this should be a key priority to really drive the long-term sustainability of your organization.
At a very basic level, so many of these regulations basically come down to supply chain visibility. Who doesn't want supply chain visibility? I mean, that's good for everybody. It's inarguable. So good point. This questioner is asking for some examples of extended ESG metrics that should be tracked along the value chain. They're really asking you to kind of drill down a little bit here.
Yeah. So we think about, ESG, metrics, the core foundational ones is around, emissions and, and the like. But what we've seen more so is, I mentioned, earlier, right? Human rights, really thinking about those specific metrics around, what are your, labor practices, right? From an ethics standpoint, right? From a reputation standpoint, what are those things you're doing in terms of ethical practices? Really honing in on that. From a D&I standpoint, so beyond just are you a diverse supplier, diversity owned, but what are you doing within your organization to drive equitable outcomes, within your organization as a supplier? What are your commitments from both a D&I standpoint, a diversity, equity, and inclusion standpoint? And then as we think about, diversity in terms of socioeconomic outcomes, as I said, beyond just how much you're spending with that supplier, but how do you make sure that those dollars are directly going to those underserved communities? And how do you measure that? So one way is through tax revenues in those communities that we're serving, et cetera. So those are just some examples of how we think about extended ESG metrics.
This questioner wants to know a little bit more about details about supplier diversity, because it is a separate thing within the whole ESG spectrum. How can organizations tie these supplier diversity initiatives to the larger ESG goals?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's funny when people think ESG, and even the kind of presentation kind of directed, right? It's focused on environmental and sustainability, but there's an S, there's a social.
The social, right?
And within that is supplier diversity is where it comes in. So I do think being able to make sure that I think about sustainability as sustainability of our organization, both from an environmental sustainability and from a social sustainability as we think about your markets and your people, right? So when I think about, and it's an interesting concept, I actually think about sustainability as also how do you sustain your organization by making sure that you have those equitable outcomes within your workforce, within the markets, within your community, right? So I also think that is also sustainable. So when you're having those ESG conversations, I would also think about it as, hey, it's about equity as well as we think about, how do you maintain your sustainable supply chain? It's about also having fairness and access and a sense of belonging and inclusion is also part of that sustainability metric.
Great. Well, unfortunately, Milton, we are just about out of time. We have time for just one final question, and it's going to be this one. Ready? What are the steps I need to take, this questioner is saying, to really build a sustainable supply chain? I mean, they've got all this information from you in the last hour. How do they go ahead and proceed, and what do they do with it? What are the big steps?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, the first thing you need to do is, as we think about supplier onboarding process, utilizing those metrics, as I talked about, those advanced ESG KPIs and metrics, to evaluate and select that appropriate supplier. And it requires suppliers to submit their D&I, ESG codes of conduct up front in order to make sure you're bringing in the right suppliers as you onboard them. Second, collecting advanced supplier data on their ESG practices from that RFX event and sustainability assessments helps you understand the supplier behavior from the onset to help to drive that collaboration. Third, accelerating, as we talked about in the talk, a supplier awareness through forums, right, to really share industry best practices to make sure these suppliers know the latest trends, and also training programs to help them amend their ESG practice and achieve those benefits we've discussed. Fourth, developing analytics, right, data-driven analytics, intelligence, AI, machine learning type tools to help proactively track and monitor those ESG targets along your value chain and help benchmark those targets against those competitors and industry benchmarks in order to figure out where those opportunities are to grow and to thrive in this landscape. And then finally, identify those specific product and services strategies to help suppliers improve their ESG profiles to unlock sustainable and equitable value across your extended value chain. So if you focus on these things, right, from the onset, bringing in the right suppliers, collecting the right data at the extended level, driving that supplier awareness and collaboration, having intelligence and analytics in the back end, and really driving strategies that really helps them improve, that can create a very sustainable, resilient, supply chain as we get into some of these ebbs and flows of the market. That's what I'll say.
Those are some great concrete steps. And of course, I think we can agree that companies really have no choice but to move in the direction of ESG compliance on all the fronts, as you mentioned today, Milton. They've got regulators on one side, you got very demanding customers on another, you got investors on another, and the need to create a more diverse supplier base. All these points you've made so well today. Milton, thanks very much for this great presentation. And audience, I want to also thank you. But before we go, I want to remind you to please stay tuned for the sixth and final episode in this six-part series on creating resilient supply chains through IT innovation, presented by Deloitte Consulting. The topic next time will be innovations in supply chain planning and optimization of data. It goes live on June 29th at 11 a.m. Eastern. Information on accessing the show, you don't need to hurry, rush and copy that down. Information on accessing the show will be included in an email sent to all registrants, so don't miss that one. And don't miss our first 4 episodes in this 6-part series. They're all archived and waiting for you to watch. Information on accessing those will also be included to the email sent to all registrants. So once again, I want to thank my great speaker today, Milton Jones of Deloitte Consulting. Thanks very much. Really appreciate that. Thank you, audience, for your attendance and for your great questions. And everybody, have a great day.